Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. I really enjoyed doing, and it seems like there was a really positive reaction to the last episode of this podcast, which was essentially two liberal currents authors, myself and Kevin Elliott, comparing and talking about our recent pieces on the American right and how we think fascism is an appropriate term for the Trump movement. And I think that we'd both had big popular facing pieces on that, and just comparing our thoughts made for a really interesting episode. This one is kind of a sequel to that, or a continuation of it, or a companion to it. It's also two liberal currents authors talking about their work, but this time on the other side of the aisle, talking about the political left broadly in America, and specifically the Democratic Party. What has been going wrong here over the last decade? What needs to change? And what changes would those of us who want it to change have to make in order to achieve that? My guest today is Samantha Hancox Lee. She's an associate editor at Liberal Currents and has written a few pieces you'll hear about in this episode about what is wrong with the Democratic Party and what sort of vision of constitutional and social reform they need to be putting forward. And I've also had a piece that got a considerable amount of attention, this time in the New Republic, not Liberal Currents, but still, about why attempts to reform the Democratic Party from within have failed, why on the right the Tea Party succeeded as an activist revolt, but the Bernie movement, by and large, although it changed the tone of the party in some ways, was not able to change the personnel of the party in the way that the Tea Party did. So what I thought would be really interesting was to put those two sides together. Why we might want the Democratic Party to change in some respects, and how we might want to do that and put them in conversation with each other. And that's what this episode is. As always, if you like the show, please do sponsor it on Patreon, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. As you know, I don't interrupt these shows with any ads, I don't have any commercial sponsors, so all of this is made possible by the voluntary and generous support of listeners. If you do that already, thank you so much. If you have been enjoying the show for a bit, please consider chipping in. Links to that at Patreon, or just check out my website for links to the podcast writing, how to support everything. That's politicalphilosophypodcast.com, all one word, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. I'll put the links to all of the articles that we reference here in the show notes. Other than that, let's get straight to it. This is Firing the Generals with Samantha Hancox Lee. Hey, I am joined today by my Liberal Currents comrade in arms, Samantha Hancox Lee. Samantha, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Toby.
Let me just start with this. What, in your eyes, is wrong with the Democratic Party of the last 5 or 10 years?
So,
Big
as you
question, I know,
know,
but
big question. As you may know, I'm kind of a military history nerd. I find military history very interesting.
yeah, me too.
Um, and I'm currently in the middle of a book called On the Psychology of Military Incompetence. It's a follow-up, or I'm reading it as a follow-up to another book called The Rules of the Game, which is also about military incompetence. And these books argue that peacetime produces a particular kind of army, a particular kind of military leadership where people are obsessed with following the rules because that's how you get ahead. There are well-known rules and there's a well-known social order, and you just kind of work your way through the social order. And then a war comes. And in a war, suddenly all the rules are out the window. And suddenly you are faced with a situation where there is so much uncertainty in the world. There is so much uncertainty with every action you could possibly do. The enemies all around you. Clausewitz talks about like the phantasmal fears that afflict you in war, not just the real things that are all around you, but your imagination and your fear of responsibility. That especially as a general, there are these men who are generals who have displayed immense physical courage, but they lack moral courage. They lack the moral courage to take responsibility for plans that might not work out. Um, and what this all adds up to is a successful general in a wartime situation needs to have a certain kind of aggression, initiative, but also a willingness to take responsibility for risky outcomes. And I think what's wrong with the Democratic Party today is that we have people who are afraid to take responsibility and that they are clinging to old certainties, to the rules of normal politics. Um, and as I've written about for liberal currents, they have a certain fear of power. They have a fear of exercising power because they are afraid of taking responsibility for their actions and making things happen. And maybe things go wrong, but you need to take chances in our situation. I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, but I think that's kind of where I've
No,
come down
I
on
stay
this.
by that. And I've weirdly, I don't know if I got it from you. I'm not sure if it was in the articles I've read of yours, but I've used the exact same metaphor myself. There's a bit in The Godfather where he says to Tom, "You're not a wartime consigliere. It's not that you're bad at what you do. I don't need a peacetime person. I need a wartime person." That strikes me of like if you ask what's wrong with Chuck Schumer, right? Is it that he's a neoliberal capitalist sellout who actually wants to accelerate the contradictions of fascism because he wants to get to that story? No, no, he's probably not like a bad guy, but he's a peacetime consigliere, right? Like that's his
Yeah.
issue. And I mean, yeah, I'm also a military history nerd. I think we need like a club for military history nerds who are not fascist dipshits.
Uh,
Um,
it's true. There are a lot of unfortunate people in that particular hobby, but
but I think the First World War in particular, what all of the great powers had to do as they got into that conflict was just almost like gut and recycle their leadership. So, as France starts in the opening phases before it settles into trench warfare, when they're just getting hammered and collapsing, what Joffre's doing to sort that situation is essentially firing people. Like,
yes.
he's just going round and people who, like, can't do that, just like take a deep breath and throw your troops forward thing. Okay, you're out. This like junior colonel, he seemed to show a bit of gumption. Put him in, you know? And like you kind of and that was not everything. There was a lot of stuff going on then, but that is a lot of what stabilized the French army at that point, is they just had to fire a lot of their officer corps. And all the great powers had to do that. It was particularly striking in France. And yeah, I do sort of feel like that's kind of what, for a variety of reasons, that's kind of what's needed with the Democratic Party right now. Like a lot of people are just entrenched in positions. And it's not contra my comrades on the left that these are awful, evil capitalist swine. They're just too timid. That you need to be able to make a call where both sides present unacceptable risks, because that is the call that you have to make.
Yes. Yeah, so I think your point about personnel policies is kind of key. Thomas Ricks makes this argument in The Generals, arguing that the American military is successful in World War II because we fired or we relieved a lot of officers and we relieved them very rapidly. Where it's like, are you not producing results? Do you have a major screw up? You're going home. And you're not, your career isn't necessarily over, right? It's not the end of the world for you. You're going to go run a training battalion somewhere. You'll still have a career, but like, we can't have you in frontline command. You're just not ready for it. And that this was like very effective at cleaning out the dead wood. And yeah, I think we are in a similar situation today. Where we have Democrats who, yeah, like you say, might have been great in peacetime, but today are, like I've talked about, clinging to the old certainties of politics because they're too afraid to throw a punch.
Well, let me give you an example. And, you know, like, people really loathe Chuck Schumer, and I'm not really defending the guy. I don't think that it's that he actively wants fascism or
No,
anything.
absolutely not. I
You
mean,
know,
I people on the internet say all kinds of things, but Chuck Schumer is not a fascist. Chuck Schumer is a liberal. He actually believes in all these things. I'm not sure he's an effective leader in the
yeah.
time that we have.
I mean, to use our analogy, the French generals who were seeing the front just collapse on them in 1914 did not want France to lose.
No,
They just weren't good at their jobs. You know, all their jobs had changed so radically that the thing that they'd been learning their entire life was no longer relevant, and the time frame that it would take for them to learn the new thing was just much longer than the time frame they had to operate in. Like that's the problem. But anyway, so to an example, Jeffries and Schumer both do this thing where they're like, we think it's unacceptable that the president has taken this plane from Qatar as a bribe. Okay, therefore, we have introduced a bill in the Senate to say he can't do it. Okay, so this is a peacetime move, right? This is a messaging bill where you put something on the floor to force Republicans to vote against it so that you can run ads against them in the next election. We are so far beyond that world. That is that is doing it's doing less than nothing because you're kind of signaling by putting a messaging bill up that the taking of the plane is legal and you're making it illegal. You know, like, and as if these Republicans care that you might bring this up 4 years from now, as if that's the sort of way electorates are behaving now. You know, it's just they've really internalized one set of rules, and we've flipped over the chessboard, and now you've got to punch a guy in the face. Like that's now the world
To put
we're
it
in.
metaphorically.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, this is I had Will Stansel, the notorious Will Stansel, on the Neon Liberalism podcast a few weeks ago, and he talked about the difference between the kind of engineered showdown earlier this year about the budget bill, about whether Democrats would support the continuing resolution to keep the government funded. That didn't really impress anybody. And as Stancil put it, it didn't impress anybody because everybody knew the answer. The bill was getting passed, right? It was just like a little procedural question of like, are we going to have this kind of cloture vote and who's going to vote against this kind of cloture vote? But everyone knows the outcome already, so there's no drama to it, right? And this is contrasted with Senator Van Hollen just going to El Salvador, right? This is not an official act in an official capacity. It's not a bill in Congress. It's not an action with a known outcome, right? He didn't know if he was going to get to see Abrego Garcia. He didn't know what was going to come of him going to El Salvador and trying to see this man who had been unlawfully deported or unlawfully removed, I suppose. Um, and that's part of why it captures attention because of the drama, because of the uncertainty. But that's the kind of act that it requires a particular kind of moral courage to engage in because you don't know if it's going to blow up in your face. You don't know the outcome. There are no rules there are no rules of normal politics for trying to visit a mega jail in El Salvador, but you take the fight to the enemy.
Well, let me give you another military metaphor, one I've used a few times to describe Trump's strategy is reconnaissance in force. It's this idea that you don't really even necessarily know where the enemy positions are. You don't know how, maybe even if you know this many troops are in this location, you don't know what they'll do if when the shooting starts. So the idea is you take your least valuable troops and you attack everywhere to see what's weak. And I feel like this is what Trump does a lot. I feel like the 2020 attempt to overturn that election was kind of reconnaissance in force. Like a lot of it, as a micro example, looked stupid. Like Giuliani standing out of Four Seasons Total Landscaping with his face melting, like did not seem like strategic wisdom. And while a lot of it was tactically dumb, there was a sort of strategy there, which is we know in theory what will stop you doing a coup in America? There's these sorts of constitutional constraints, there's these sorts of legal court, whatever. But actually, if you really hammered at it, everything, no one's really tried this. We don't know where the hinge points would be. So let's just try it. And they felt, apparently correctly, that there wouldn't really be consequences for this. So they just tried it. And it's very like the Russians in World War II being like, well, Germany beats us on tanks and aircraft, but we have a lot more guys, so let's just throw them at them and see where the weak points are and hammer home them. And it's not a crazy idea if you're sufficiently ruthless about it. And I feel like that's what Trump did. And that's what we kind of do now. There's no playbook here. There's no rules of the road for how you do this. This is just a literally unprecedented situation. And I feel like reconnaissance in force, attack everywhere, and when you start to make openings, hammer them home. Like that's the play, I think. And it's something I think the Democratic Party really struggles with being that, I don't want to say flippant, but like being that just casual with it. Like we're just going to go for it.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna suggest emulating meat wave assaults. Although the example that I like is from US Grant's memoirs, where he talks about a very early battle he was involved in, where he's commanding a very small force, and he has heard that there's a rebel force that's up over on the other side of this hill, and he's marching there, and he arranges his men, and they're marching up this hill, and he says, "I have never been so afraid in my life." And all I wanted to do was turn around, but I didn't have the moral courage to tell my soldiers to turn around. So we just kept on going up the hill, and we got to the top, and there was no one there. We found an empty rebel camp, but they were all gone. And he said, and I realized that they had as much reason to be afraid of me as I had of them. And as he puts it, the lesson was instructive, and it remained with me for the remainder of the war. Right, and I think there's a kind of a way where the fear of taking a hit can lead you into a kind of defensive crouch where you never throw a punch. And that gives your adversary an enormous room to maneuver because they know that you're afraid of them. They know you're not going to throw a punch unless it's a sure thing. So they can try a lot of stuff and maneuver around you and try new things. And so conversely, you kind of have to try a lot of stuff. You have to, like I've been talking about, be willing to take the initiative and take risks, even when it's not necessarily a sure thing. And like you say, that can be revealing of what's actually possible, right? There's there's an older blog post again that I really like about, I don't have the name of it off the top of my head, about the notion of possibility in politics and about how in certain times the range of possibilities looks very narrow and the boundaries of consensus and like, oh well, surely that could never happen is so strong that you can't possibly get over it. And then what's the phrase they use? You hear the footsteps of the Lord of Hosts marching through history. And you realize all of a sudden that the boundaries of the possible have shifted, and they have shifted dramatically, and that all the old certainties are no longer so constraining, and you can really change things. Right, and we've seen Trump try to do this throughout his first term, where he is using all kinds of discretionary powers, abusing discretionary powers, everything involving the Department of Government Efficiency, which is like probably just unconstitutional, I mean, in a variety of ways, um, to just try everything and see what's actually going to stick, right? And I think Democrats are afraid of trying anything similar.
I mean, one thing I've said a lot is, and I'm hardly the first to say it, is while you could meaningfully talk, maybe even until the last election about protecting the underlying constitutional order from Trump, that no longer makes sense as a thing to say. That constitutional order is gone. I mean, we haven't like literally changed the constitution, but a lot of it has become dead letter. And a lot of it is in the process of being aggressively recontested. I don't think what Democrats can put forward, and what I fear is that this is what they're going to put forward, is we're going to return to the old order. Regardless of if that's desirable, I just don't think it's possible. I think, say we have a free and hypothetically, say we have a free and fair election in 2028 and a Democrat wins it. That's not wild as a possibility. We could still be there. Um, but if their plan is Biden 2.0, right? Let's try and get some big progressive things done, but we're just going to follow the rules ourselves, and we're going to, in our own personal virtue and how we approach government, show how it thinks we should be done in the hopes that Republicans, when they take back over, will emulate that. That is, I think, at this point, obviously naive and obviously, to sort of use your language, just asking to be hit, you know? So that can't be it because it's gone. Like a constitutional order requires consequences for the rules being broken, and that has gone now. So we need to, you know, I don't know that if we're in like a socialism or barbarism moment, as the left would have it, but say we are. Cool, we need to be open to those sorts of big ideas. And or even more pragmatically, we need to think what governance looks like, because it's not going to be what went before.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I've written about this for Liberal Currents in a pair of essays, The Present Crisis and the End of the Long Nineties, where I talk about what was the constitutional settlement that we kind of all understood and all grew up with. And I think of a constitutional settlement, not as the text of the Constitution necessarily, but as a kind of a constellation of a political system that may interpret the Constitution in various ways, an economic system, and a cultural system that kind of ties it all together. And I think all of those are in the process of breaking down or have kind of irrevocably broken down in America. Um, and to kind of rehearse the arguments of that article, I think the political system we had was basically defined by the slow atrophy of Congress. Um, that in some ways, Congress is supposed to be the branch that is the mainspring of governance. The founders understood that Congress was in some ways the primary branch, um, and that it was supposed to represent people, and like that's why it has the power of the purse, among other things. Um, and Congress has just kind of given away its power to the presidency. Congress has given away its power to the court. Um, and to basically allow a government that's balanced not on three legs between a Congress and a court and a president, but just two, between an imperial presidency and an overweening court that is clearly just at this point setting various kinds of national policy and national legislation based on their own preferred understanding of the Constitution. And that's, I think, ultimately not a stable equilibrium. Um, and I think very clearly some members of the Trump administration recognize this problem. They've written about it. Russ Vought has written about this. And like their answer is like, well, we want to also break the court and we want to break Congress and we want it to be just the president who, through his like personalist, charismatic power, just pushes on the Constitution, pushes on the law, makes things happen. Um, so I think we're seeing that kind of breakdown. I think very clearly for a lot of people, the economic system is not working. I think we've heard a lot about this from a variety of people, and I think that's fundamentally because the economic system as we understood it is based on asset appreciation. rather than wage growth, basically. And that, especially housing, basically the inflation of housing prices. Um, More complicated economic story there, but like the most visible end result of this is the housing crisis, right? That as the price of your house goes up, so does the price of everybody else's house. And after a certain point, it just becomes unsustainable. The cost of housing is eating up far too much of everybody's budget. The artificial scarcity of fundamental goods in our society, like housing, like education, like healthcare, is an artificial scarcity. And we need to kind of unwind that. Trump's economic views are crazy and kind of an incoherent mishmash here because there's so many different factions kind of competing. Anyways, I'm going to kind of skip to the end here and say I don't think we're going to be able to go back to this, right? I don't think we can effectively go back to a situation where, oh yeah, Congress doesn't really do anything, and we're going to elect a new president, and we're going to give them a lot of power, but they only use it for good. And we're not going to change anything about the economy. We're still going to have artificial scarcity. The price of housing is still going to keep on going up. The price of an education is going to keep on going up. We're not going to do anything about that. No one's going to like that outcome. Um, and so I think we really need to put forth a vision of a better future for America, a new constitutional settlement that addresses some of these fundamental contradictions.
Let me, I don't know if push back, but maybe complicate a bit the story about Congress, because look, on one level, that's certainly true, is Congress has fallen away, right? Um, on the other, my sort of thought there and why I is here's the thing. I think there's two different sort of aspects to a political system. There's like structures and praxis. There's like what is the institution? How do we elect people to Congress? What are the rules of Congress? How many branches of government are there? How do they interact? Blah 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 blah. Right? There's then what do voters think they are doing when they cast a ballot? What are the frameworks they are making that decision with? How do they think they're supposed to hold a politician accountable? How do politicians think that they're being held accountable? What do politicians see their job as doing when they're elected? And I say all that to say, obviously, what's happened in America is the structures and the praxis have come apart quite significantly, right? So we have this model of how our government is supposed to work if we elect a legislative to pass laws and executive to exit. That's not how voters are behaving. That's not how candidates are behaving. Voters are behaving as if we elect the president to make policy and then we elect Congress as a referendum on the president, right? And
Mhm.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I think that's right. And I think on some level, what I'm trying to say is that voters are reacting rationally to how the system has been working. In some ways, right? Yeah, like you look at how our system has functioned, and like a lot of power has accrued to the presidency. Um, and the president can get a lot of stuff done. And people are, less concerned about Congress because they don't feel that Congress represents them. And I think that this ties in that there are ways to explain this in terms of the structure of our institutions. So, for example, there was just an election in the city where I live, which is Pittsburgh, where we had a primary for the mayor. Oh, the mayoral primary was just a couple of days ago. Um, Pittsburgh is a city of 300 something thousand people. 40,000 people voted in that primary, and Corey O'Connor won. I don't know, yeah, I got something like 25,000 votes. So Pittsburgh's a very blue city. Whoever wins the Democratic primary is going to be the mayor. The mayor of Pittsburgh has been decided now in a small election that happened in May for some reason, right? Not what people and so this has created a sense in this you can see this how to sorry, I'm getting a little tied up here. You can see this in many elections across America. In many of the very safe seats for Congress and for other places, for other offices, where really it's only the primary that matters. Most people don't vote in the primary. Politicians are really only responsible to that very narrow sliver of a primary electorate. And so they don't really need necessarily to be accountable to the great mass of people in their district. They need to be accountable to their own most aggressive partisans. And I think that this has contributed to polarization. I think that this has contributed to the dysfunction of Congress. Right? And you see it very clearly on the Republican side, where Republicans are not interested in compromise. They are only interested in the most rabid of their own partisans while in office. And there are structural reasons for that. And I think there are structural things we can do to change it. So, for example, we could increase the size of the House, which has been capped since like 1929. The nation's population has expanded enormously in that period. And the relatively small number of House members relative to the population means that it's easy to gerrymander districts to create these safe seats. Um, and so just increasing the size of the House would do a lot to increase its democratic responsiveness. Moving to multi-member proportional districts or voting rather than first past the post voting would do a lot to ensure that, like, yeah, even if you can't win an outright majority, you're going to be represented in Congress and your vote is going to matter and is going to matter to politicians. I think that can do a lot to restore the link between Congress and the people. And I think that can really motivate Congress to be more assertive with its own power because they'll actually need to start delivering results rather than just, posturing for the cameras.
Although there is another way to think about it, and I'm not against any of that, but which is that, you can think, okay, we change institutions and hope the sort of praxis will follow along behind them. The other is to say the praxis has just changed. And maybe like we need to think about our institutions as how do they most productively channel that praxis. And very broadly speaking, you can imagine two different sets of total attitudes about how a political system is supposed to work. One of which you could call congressional, which is how the US system is supposed to work, which is at a very basic level, a system of rolling inputs. There's many elections, many bodies, and legitimacy comes through once those people are empowered, the decisions and compromises that they make together. The other would be parliamentary, and parliamentary is much more stop and start. There are big, decisive, legitimizing moments, and you go 4 years and then there's another one. We elect a government as a one-time, one-shot thing, and then we review them in 4 years. My read is one of the fundamental contradictions of American politics is we're trying to practice parliamentary praxis in a congressional set of institutions. That voters are approaching it as we want to empower a president for 4 years. We'll tell them if we don't like it halfway through, and then we'll give an up or down vote in another 4 years. That's what most voters seem to think that they're doing. Um, but our institutions are just not even remotely designed for that type of input. So like my challenge, and I've asked, literal senators this, is, we can say, okay, if we change the institutions, will maybe that praxis go back to a more sort of congressional praxis? Or is it that that's just how Americans want to vote? And maybe the institutional design needs to be downstream of that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this gets back to a bit of what we were talking about at the start about how constrained you think you are by rules and norms as they currently exist. And one thing that we've had several articles about this at Liberal Occurrence that we all seem to believe there is that popular opinion isn't fixed and that you can change culture. You can change how people think, and you can do it in a variety of ways. But one of the ways you do it is by leadership, especially if you are the leader of a political party or a political figure with some power. You have the power, you have the ability to set and drive the national conversation far more than an ordinary person does. And how to do it, you can ask me about that, but you have that power. And I think that's what we need right now. I think the kind of presidentialism that you're describing is pretty dangerous. And if you look at other countries across the world, if you look at these kinds of comparative politics studies, Juan Lin's is kind of the famous argument here. Presidentialism is pretty dangerous um, because it leads to basically the risk of personalism, personality cults around the figure of a president who says only I can fix it and I should be president for life and yada yada. And so you can easily get the decay of democratic and liberal institutions through that kind of governance, which is why I've been advocating trying to convince people to make reforms in a more congressional direction.
Well, yeah, and I mean, that is the way literal parliamentary systems solve that problem, right? So, for instance, the UK system, which has not been firing on all cylinders either recently, but the way that solves that in theory is voters don't want to have this constant cycle of rolling elections where they have to look at individual candidates and act. No, no, they want an up and down vote every 4 years. So the way you do that is the up and down vote is for the legislator, not the executive. And then the
Mhm.
legislator appoints the executive who is in principle accountable to the legislator. Does that always work? Of course not. But that at least gets around some of, and what you're voting for there is not an individual, but a party. That's sort of how you take that, we just want it once every 4 years and done instinct and kind of temper it. The problem is when that we just want it once every 4 years instinct goes through the executive, then you get to the presidentialism stuff. I think what has to be changed in terms of what we ask people to believe in isn't so well, is certainly could you please stop being fucking fascists? That would be nice. But is as much as anything, can you please get out of this kind of thermostatic voting behavior? Like what I think the pitch that needs to be made quite explicitly is you need to empower us for a decade. Like you need to put us in for a project of constitutional reform that we are going to tell you what it is and what we're doing, but we need you to empower us to do this for a long stretch. And I don't think any politician has been able to make that argument. I think Democrats kind of often run on like, elect me and we'll do these things, but they don't tell the story of like what that will entail. Whereas Republicans, at least in one instance, which would be the capture of the court system, were able to message, at least to their own activists, maybe not the entire electorate, but at least to the sort of most bought in people, this is a long-term structural thing that we're doing here. This is what the ultimate payoffs are. This is how it will work. And they got the buy-in of their activists to that long-run thing. I think Democrats, whatever our long-run constitutional reform project is, we need that more long-term buy-in from like our core voters and activists. I don't see anything like that, if I'm being honest.
No, I think that's right. I think on so I've written about this. There's an older essay called "How Movements Win," um, where I talk about the need, the importance of kind of establishing a consensus among, like you say, your activists, your base, and your kind of intellectual class about like what are we trying to do here? Like, what is the program? What are our policies? How is this a project that we're going to carry forward? Um, and I think Democrats have been a little bit at sea on that question for a long time. Um, right, that there has not been that kind of consensus about like, what are we doing here? Right? What future of America are we trying to build other than, oh, we'll kind of keep things the way they are and like maybe tweak it around the edge here or there and like make things a little bit better in this way, but we're not really selling people on a project of transformation and restoration. Which I think, again, in these times, we need that project. We need it because like we need to do it because there are real problems we need to fix, but also to, inspire, our most committed voters to like actually turn out the way they did not necessarily turn out for Harris is with that kind of long-term project, that kind of vision for a future of America.
So let me move us on to the how then, because I think there's a lot of reasons, and we've touched some of them, why we need to fire the generals, essentially, or at least fire enough of them that we can get a bit of a cultural change. And I do think the Republican Tea Party is something of a model here. Like, there's all sorts of disanalogies, of course, but like they got, I believe, 40 House seats in the big 2010 swing and 5 Senate seats. So it's not a majority of the caucus, but that is enough to change the culture and change the direction. And obviously, their goals are very different to ours. But something like that, I think if we could clear out, you know, 20% of the dead wood in Congress in the Democratic side, that would go a long way. Here's the practical challenge of that is what I've just written about is there's kind of like three groups in a party. There's the politicians, the activists, and the primary voters, right? And ideally you want them all on the same page, but oftentimes in the old politics that our politicians are used to, divisions would occur within those groups. So you'd have two different factions within the politicians, and then they'd compete for support amongst the activists and base voters. What we're increasingly seeing, both on the left and the right, is conflict between those different groups as defining of a party. The Republican Tea Party was an activist revolt against their leadership. The Bernie movement was a failed activist revolt against their leadership. And the reason it failed is in the original Tea Party, the activists and the base voters were on the same page. Essentially, we are existentially opposed to a black president and a symbolically equal society, and we feel our own political class has been insufficiently aggressive in opposition to this. And both the activists and the base voters in unison on that. The problem with the Democratic Party, and one of the reasons it's kind of just folded in the face of Trump, is the activists and the base voters are on very different pages. They're more or less aligned on policy, but their narrative about what Trump is and where he came from and how to fight him and what we need to do about him are essentially opposed. At its base, do you see Trump as an action or a reaction? Is this someone who is appealing to, propagandizing, reinforcing, and recruiting American racism, sexism, and xenophobia? Or do you see those things as downstream of a failed economy? That's the divide, right? And people get really heated, as I have on both sides of this. But what that means is the activists can't go to the base voters and say the politicians aren't working. Can we switch them out? Because the base voters don't trust the activists to do a better job, and sometimes don't trust them to do a better job for valid reasons, right?
Hmm.
And that's that I think is one what has both really weakened the Democratic Party over the last 10 years. But two is that's, I think, the problem that has to be solved if we want to fire the generals is like we're structurally locked in at the moment in a system where the activists are honestly, through a lot of their own missteps, kind of impotent to challenge the politicians. And like, I don't know how that pairs up with our vision, because our vision does not neatly align to those two tribes. Our vision isn't necessarily of the core liberals or of the activist left. It's of a reform agenda and of more housing and of all of this. I think it's the how do we make it happen bit that's the real challenge.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that question, the question of how, because I know you've gotten a lot of pushback online for this for a variety of different reasons. You know, people saying, "Oh, you can't call us the Tea Party," or "How dare you criticize us?" Blah blah blah. And for me, sort of my political life lately has been shaped by loss, by the failure of various political projects. And I just feel like when you fail, you can either A, try to learn from that failure, or you can engage in some kind of cope. And you can cope in all kinds of ways. You can have some stab in the back myth about how actually everything was going great, but just these nefarious evildoers undid us and it wasn't our fault. Or you can argue that we never really failed. Actually, everything's going great and abolish the police was a totally successful movement. People will say that online. And I think that's crazy because you are just denying because these aren't, how to put this, these aren't moral questions we're trying to ask here. We are trying to ask tactical questions about how do you get something done? And if you are substituting moral questions or questions over your own standing or a status threat or whatever it is, for these tactical questions, you are going to run into real serious trouble when you try to get something done in the world. So that's kind of my premise here is that this isn't a question about who's right and who's wrong and the justice of this or that clause. This is just a question about how to win, because I would like to win.
Yeah.
Um,
I
right.
think
And I
to
think,
highlight one word, cope, and it's not just the left. I see this in the press. I see this in reactionary centrists. I see it in so many different factions of America. People who've got this wrong, not because they're
mhm.
evil people, but because people get things wrong. And well, sometimes they're bad people, but just they've had the wrong account of this, and they'd rather be just stuck in a corner than admit that they were wrong. And that has to be an attitudinal
Yeah.
shift that changes. But I see it in a lot of different places.
I mean, this very much does come back to the kinds of military theory we started off talking about because it takes a kind of moral courage to admit you were wrong. It's comforting to insist that you were right and nothing's gone wrong and everything's fine. It doesn't require you to engage in any kind of self-reflection. Admitting you were wrong is tough, but I think we have to do it. And so to kind of return to the particular questions here, I think you're right to see kind of the Bernie era as an activist revolt against the party and one that failed. You have some numbers in your piece about how the Justice Democrats didn't really do very well at the polls. Right? They did not unseat a large swath of Democrats. Several of them went on to fail to be reelected for all kinds of reasons. Um, Bernie's certainly been influential in changing the tenor and the culture of the party, but on a personnel level, not at all. And I think that's important. And the argument you kind of make here is that, if I can summarize you a little bit, is that the
Yeah, please.
activists have this issue where they are running against the party, but they're also running against their own base. Right? That the activist left is generally extremely critical of the Democratic Party, not specific Democratic politicians, but the Democratic Party in general. They hate it, and they tell you they hate it, and even when they're trying to be Democrats, you can kind of tell they hate it. Um, and that this is deeply off-putting to many of the core primary voters of the Democratic Party. That the core primary voters of the Democratic Party are there because they like the Democratic Party. Right, and many of them, I mean, many Americans like America, right? And if you're running against America, you're going to be in real trouble in an American election. Um, so I think that's a really serious issue. The Tea Party was successful. Like, what's the famous epithet? Republican in name only. Like that was their charge, that we are more Republican than you are, right?
Exactly. And a lot
You
of
have sold out the
people
party.
have pushed that one back on me and said, oh, but the Republicans ran against rhinos. And what does rhino stand for? It stands for a charge of betrayal of the party, right?
Yes.
They're not running on Republicans suck and are awful. They're running on you're not a real Republican and I am, right?
Yes.
And like if you want your critic, I'm just like
And that's
listen
just
to
a
me or
much
not,
more
but I'm
appealing message to people
uh,
whose core identity is I am a real Republican.
yeah, and like so for doing this piece, I talked to literally a few dozen Biden 2020 voters. And here's just an anecdote for how the activist left needs to change. I asked a bunch of my activist friends, do you know any Biden 2020 primary voters who would be willing to talk to me? And the response was amazing. It was Biden voters. I mean, wait, you mean in the primary? They couldn't even understand the thought that they didn't have anyone in their social circles who had been a Biden voter in the primary. Like he was just alien to them. But this is 20 million people to Bernie's 10, right? It's more people. Like this is who you need to win. Now,
This is precisely the people you need to win if you want to try again.
and
Yeah.
now the Biden voters went a bit further with this than I would, I think. I was for Warren for whatever that's worth, right? Um, for me personally, do I need is the person I'm casting a ballot for? Do they need to love the Democratic Party? Yeah, it's not as fundamental to my identity. Um, for a lot of them, they flat said I would not vote for someone who's a registered independent. I personally wouldn't go that far. At the same time, that is just not a big concession to make in my eyes. You know, like if that's the sticking point, well, that seems very, very solvable to me.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think Bernie's an old man. He's unlikely to change, but it's an instructive lesson for anyone else who wants to try and walk down this road. Um, right, is that these are precise, like as I was saying, precisely the people you have to appeal to. Um, there's a book I really like called Hegemony How To by Jonathan Smucker. Jonathan Smucker is a very long time, very committed radical leftist activist. And he was at the battle in Seattle. He was at Occupy Wall Street. He's been involved in all kinds of union organizing and this organizing and that organizing all over the country. Like this is his life. And he talks about the dysfunctions of certain kinds of leftist groups where you get more engaged in maintaining your own social cred within that group and not appealing to people outside the group. And that these are actually very antagonistic goals because how do you maintain your social cred inside a leftist group is you posture it being more radical than other people. And this can lead you to a kind of spiral where everybody's trying to pull the same move. And it just leads you to these kinds of policy positions, to the not even policy positions, but to a kind of aesthetics and a kind of communication strategy that is alienating to the people you actually need on your side in order to win. Um,
We need a bit of a changing of the generals, or I guess changing of the junior staff in this case of the activists as well, because the politicians need cleaning out. I think we're all agreed on that. But like a lot, I think within the sort of Bernie left, there's broadly two groups, and I'm going back and forth in my head on which one's larger. The first of which is at some level gets that this didn't work. Exactly how far that they'll go in changing is a different matter. But I have got a lot of comments on my piece saying I was a Bernie voter. I knocked doors for him both times. This has a bit of truth to it, right? I've also got the sort of go fuck yourself, which is like, and I just wonder, does that section of the left activist base need changing out? Now, you can't fire an activist. It's sort of like it's something you opt into. But does that just mean more of us on the sort of less dogmatic Bernie side or the sort of Warren progressive type people? We just need to step up a bit more and do to be fair, work that they have been doing and we've been allowing them to do for the party of kind of being our online messaging, right? Liberals have stepped back and let them have that. And if we don't like it, maybe the answer is we just have to step up.
I think that's right. This is again the kind of argument I was making in how movements win is the importance of what I call the inside strategy, which is not necessarily aimed at mass politics, but aimed at cultural change within what you might call the vanguard class. And achieving a kind of consensus among people who are committed activists, among people who are whatever, who are variously engaged intensely in this thing we call politics, changing the consensus about how to act and what to do and what to aim at. And this isn't, like you say, this is not an institutional thing, right? This is not something where you like actually have the levers to fire people because we're all just arguing with each other in this great space we call media and culture. But you actually have to do it. You have to get out there and make your case and be persuasive and achieve a kind of a social consensus on what we are trying to do here. And is it we think America is bad and we want to destroy everything, and the Democratic Party is bad for you, and then like, okay, well, policy proposal, we want to pass Medicare for all, but like there's all this messaging at the top. And it's like I don't think that's effective. I think at this point we can see that this has not been an effective strategy. And like you say, I think we kind of need to take back this cultural space about what it means to be a committed democratic activist, to be a committed progressive activist in a way that doesn't even really need to compromise on policy that much. You can still be for universal healthcare.
Not for
You can,
even at all. That's not the,
yeah.
I've literally asked so many Biden voters recently, just directly, why Biden, why not Bernie? It's not policy. And to the extent it is policy, it's stuff comes up like, oh, I liked the way Biden came out for gay marriage. I thought that was good. It's not that they were like, oh, well, I wanted a more moderate candidate. Rarely. That's sometimes the story, but more often, it's the story they tell is I felt Biden was more anti-Trump than Bernie was. And
And I,
and interestingly, a lot of them also say, and I feel he failed on that front.
I think which is just inarguably true at this point.
Yeah.
I think
But
that
but
was like the core promise of Biden was that he was going to break the back of Trumpism, and that didn't happen. So
so
here we are.
almost direct quote from a lot of people I talked to. I liked Trump is a threat to the soul of America more than I liked he's a reaction to economics. So I voted for soul of America. I feel like Biden delivered some good legislation. I do not feel Biden governed as if Trump was a threat to the soul of America. And I think that is just God's honest truth, right?
Yes.
Like that was the right decision. And like that also does point to a space where like I think a good chunk of those voters will vote for a reasonably radical challenge, but they won't if we show that we've learned absolutely nothing from it.
No, I think that's right. I think the soul of America is an interesting way to put it. One thing that I kind of genuinely do believe is that there is such a thing as the American civic religion, and many, if not most, Americans adhere to it. And part of what that means is that what we're doing in politics has a religious aspect. And you can't really talk about it in these terms.
Yeah,
People don't like it when you
yeah,
talk
yeah,
about it
yeah.
in these terms, but
But
it's
yes.
true. But like, if you want to win in America, you have to venerate the saints and the scriptures. And you can't say, I hate the saints and the scriptures. Um, People just don't respond well to it.
But no, and to we'll want to wrap, but yes, absolutely. And the left of whom we have been critiquing have a religious aspect, right? They are aspects of apocalypticism and purity in there that are not discussed in those terms, but are there, right?
Yes, it is absolutely millenarian in a very, like, the structure of millenarianism is there just perfectly.
Yeah,
And it
yeah.
drives me crazy.
That's an article I might write at some point if someone wants to publish something that people would get really upset over. But
I mean, we would, so
yeah, yeah. I will write that for you at some point. But you're right. But the flip side of that is just like political ideologies, religions are reformable things, and you get these
yes.
revival movements, and you get these changes and ebbs and flows. And yeah, I think you're right. Like in the same way, right, as if you are asking to lead the Democratic Party, it helps to not hate the Democratic Party. If you are asking to lead America, it helps to not hate America. Like,
Yes.
and I'm not too fussed either way. I don't personally stake my identity to the Democratic Party, and I'm not big on nationalism. But this is the water we're swimming in. And like
Yes.
now we need to come up with a new narrative for both. And that is a huge challenge. And we are, to go back to our military analogy, I think we are Joseph Joffre in World War One at the very beginning when the front is just collapsing all around you. And you have to fire everyone, start again, and develop a strategy for a type of war no one has ever fought before on the fly. That's where we are.
Yes. I think that's right. I think there are possibilities for us to win. I mean, people were engaged in all kinds of doomerism and are still engaged in doomerism, and I don't believe that. I believe we can win this, but we have to want to win it. And we have to think tactically and strategically about how to win it. And yeah,
Yeah, let's
and
let's
not, yeah.
let's leave it with that. We can win, but we have to want to. Samantha, thanks so much for coming on. Just to leave, I've talked about liberal currents on the show before, sort of in passing here and there. But do you want to close by just giving the audience who might not have heard that or followed me on social media a pitch for what you guys are trying to do there and where it
Sure,
is why they should
absolutely.
follow you?
Um, yeah, so Liberal Currents, we're a little website, and the one sentence pitch is we're liberals and we mean it. We actually try to take it seriously, take those promises of fundamental human rights, of democracy, of shared prosperity seriously. And so we're not just reflexively liberal, but we'll say anything, or we want to both sides everything, or all of the kind of nonsense you see from mainstream outlets these days. But there is a project, the liberal project, that we are trying to pursue, and a project that has changed the world over the last several centuries, a project that has changed the world for the better. And we are trying to do our own small piece to carry that forward today.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.